We are going to dive into today's episode, and we are so excited to have you ladies on with us. Let's start with our first true or false, and that is true false, or you can add a caveat. Cow burps and farts are destroying our planet.
Yeah, maybe we'll start with false, and it is definitely more burps than farts. That is actually how cows emit methane, is through burping. But definitely false. The number for animal agriculture here in the United States is that animal agriculture accounts for about 4% of our total greenhouse gas emissions. And if that might be surprising you, if you have read any headlines recently that say, cattle are killing the planet, as kind of you alluded to in your true and false, when in reality it is a super small percentage, and we can get into some of the nuanced conversation there behind that, but a lot smaller than most people anticipate.
We're definitely going to go deep dive on that in just a little bit. So let's get to the next question. We're just going to run through these rapid fire. We have a safe, abundant, and affordable food system.
I would say true.
Awesome. Number 3, when you buy a pound of ground beef at the supermarket, you're probably not just getting one animal.
That is true.
All imported meat should be cool, but is not. And that is country of origin labeling.
That is true. We do not have that in our food system right now.
All right. Next is raw milk is insanely dangerous to consume.
Yeah. False.
Number 6, avocado is a great alternative to the natural avocado.
What's C, the laughing option? No. False.
All right. Well, in that same vein, you girls are so excited about lab grown meat.
Yeah, false.
All right. Our audience is going to love this one. Number 8, Bill Gates and the government often release a solution prior to the problem or pandemic.
Yeah, he's one of our favorite names. Now I've even forgot, but I think it's false. I'm hoping I answered that rightly with the way you asked it.
We'll go back into that one. And then the last one is red meat allergies come from overconsumption of red meat and nothing else.
Oh, yeah. False on that one as well.
Awesome. Well, we're going to get into the cows burping and farting. Sorry.
So before we do, though, I think it's only fair that everybody know that this is, number one, an episode that we have been looking to do for a very, very long time. And so why don't you ladies just introduce who you are? We went right into the questions. We probably should have given you a formal introduction first so that everybody knows who we are talking to today. So Natalie, Tara, if you guys don't mind quickly introducing who you are to our audience.
Yeah, Tara here. I am actually a dairy farmer from New Mexico. I grew up on a dairy farm in New Mexico. I got my degree in environmental science. I didn't necessarily see myself coming back to the farm, which I feel like is kind of a classic, maybe small town rural farm kid mentality. But ultimately married my husband, who is also a 5th generation dairy farmer here in New Mexico. So I did end up back on his family farm, and I have been practicing environmental consulting for dairy farms throughout the Southwest for the last 10 years, which ultimately led me to sharing online. Kind of wanted to be able to open up our farm and be able to share more about dairy farming and sustainability on, in a social platform through, Instagram, Facebook, those kind of means. And that ultimately led me to meeting Natalie, which is where together we launched our podcast, Discover Ag, where we share about agriculture.
Yeah. So like Tara, I actually grew up in agriculture too. I grew up in Southwest Montana on a cattle ranch. And like Tara, I also got my degree elsewhere and didn't necessarily envision coming back to the family ranch. I got my degree in pharmacy. And so I was living in a bigger city in Montana, which is very relative to probably some people tuning in. But I was practicing full-time pharmacy at a hospital/clinic, and I really loved it. I spent a lot of time on my family ranch growing up, but I definitely didn't think I would marry a rancher. I didn't think I would, my income would be derived from agriculture. And I didn't think, I would be back living on a ranch. And so when I met my husband, that changed. That's how I ended up down here in Nebraska, where we run beef cattle down here. And then like Tara, I also took kind of a social media journey, which ultimately led me to her and starting our podcast, Discover Ag.
I've been loving listening to your podcast, by the way. And that's also one of the reasons why, we've personally been excited about this, because this is obviously not an area that we ourselves speak on a lot. We are all about fitness and nutrition. And everybody, though, around us knows that from a nutritional standpoint, we are very pro protein, probably far more on the carnivore end of the spectrum in terms of our preferred way of eating. And yet we always get a lot of questions around many of the true and false that we just went through. So why don't we just go ahead and jump right into that? Which one did you want to cover first?
Yeah. I think that the biggest one that most people wonder, myself included, is this whole nuance of grass-fed, grain finished, grass finished. Can you explain a little bit to us about that and what we should look for as consumers?
I'll try and keep it fairly short. So if you're listening, bear with me, but these are conversations that just have more information. They just take a little bit longer. What I always hope people can take from this question is that the grass finished versus, conventional label is merely a diet label. So it is telling you what the animal ate. That's all it is telling you. And a lot of marketing will try and spin it differently, and they'll try and make you think it is a animal welfare label. That means the animals were cared for better or differently, that maybe that somehow goes with like no antibiotics or hormones, or, I feel like a lot of things attached to those labels in our consumers' minds, and none of it is actually true. All that label is telling you is what the cattle ate. So it's very simple. The grass finish label, fed and finished, will mean that that's all the cow consumed. Grass for its entire lifetime, start to finish. So conception to harvest, grass is what they got for their diet. On the opposite end of the spectrum, if you're going for more conventional beef, which people use interchangeably with like grain finished beef, that means grain got introduced into the diet. So fun fact though, about 2/3 of an animal's life starts out the exact same. So all cows will be out at pasture with their mamas, eating grass, drinking milk. And then at that 2/3 point, when they, hit a certain weight or age, that's when it's going to diverge. So the grass finished animal will continue to eat grass, and then that conventional beef animal will go into the feedlot where the grain gets added into their diet. So at the end of the day, if you are shopping, to try and pick a label that has to do with animal welfare, if that's important to you, or if you're trying to pick an environmental label, or if you're trying to even pick a nutritional label, like one, is going to give me more macronutrients, more protein, more micronutrients, don't look for the grass finished label versus the conventional label, because all that's telling you is what the animal ate.
With regards to that, though, is there a difference in the nutritional value of the meat with one versus the other?
Yeah, there is not a significant difference, or definitely not as much as what people think. There is some micronutrient difference, but overall, I feel like, we know, in this podcast, in this space, we're talking about that steak is like a superfood, right? That it is such a nutrient powerhouse. So you are getting those nutrients no matter which one you are choosing. If you get down to the micronutrient level, there are some very small differences, but it is not as significant as people think. And so I think it depends, on kind of, Natalie mentioned, like what you are looking for in things, of which one of those you are deciding, but it's not necessarily like a healthier claim. Like the health claim associated with grass fed can often be like overinflated.
There'll be a lot of narrative that like a grain finished animal is like unhealthy, or, like they're just like fattened up. There's actually a study out of Oklahoma State that shows they did a life cycle assessment on what the cow ate from start to finish on a grain finished animal. And by the end of again, from being born to harvested, if it was a grain finished animal, only about 7% of their diet was that grain, that corn. So I think knowing that number helps put in perspective for people, because sometimes I feel like media can make you feel like that cow was just like bathe and eating corn cob. Like it's almost like a cartoon, it's like in the trough and it's like mowing down on a corn and a cob, and they're like all fat, and it's like this terrible thing. And grain is used to fatten an animal. That is the point of it. That's where you get the extra marbling from. But I think media kind of runs with that and portrays it. And so it really is a small percentage of the animal's total diet when they get that grain introduced.
Would you say, though, then the biggest difference between the two is the actual taste of the meat? Because I think that's the thing that we've probably noticed the most, is trying one versus the other. And it's like, the grass-fed, grass-finished always seems to taste a little grassy, if you will, a little earthy, compared to a grain fed. And so is that really just the biggest difference right there?
Yeah, I'm so embarrassed to say I've never actually had grass-finished beef, so I can't give my personal experience on it. But yes, it will definitely have a different taste, because again, that the corn, that grain is going to marble the animal differently. So you will get that, like the juices, the veins going through the beef, like all of that is going to be less with the great grass finished animal. The other difference, which I kind of alluded to a little bit, one reason to choose, grass finished over the grain finished would be if people do have an issue with feedlots, because that grass finished animal typically, it could be, again, it's saying is the animal consumed grass, and that could be done not at pasture. It could be done in a feedlot setting, but typically it here in the US, grass finish is a pretty small market. So it's usually like direct to consumer. And so the animal usually is out, on pasture. And there's a lot of benefits to a grazing animal that, we kind of sometimes lose when we enter that feedlot system. But again, the feedlot system is only for about 4 to 6 months of an animal's life. And I think a lot of people think that if an animal is coming out of a feedlot, that means it was like born and raised there. And that's just not true.
Yeah, another thing about the grass fed is a lot of our grass fed here in the United States is actually imported. I think it's upwards of like almost 80% is imported from countries like New Zealand, where they are more pasture based countries just based on geography and their landscape and, rainfall amounts that they're getting there. And so, yeah, as Natalie said, I think that if you're looking for like US beef grass fed, grass finished, I would definitely look for direct to consumer. That will probably be your best bet. If it's at the grocery store, you're going to have a higher chance of it being imported. Not that that's necessarily like bad or good. It depends what's, again, important to you in the meat that you're choosing. For some people, maybe choosing grass fed is more important than it being American raised. For other people, supporting American ranchers and farmers might be more important. So it really comes down to some of, what do you care about, with your food system, and where do you kind of want to spend your dollar or put your dollar vote behind as far as the type of meat you're wanting to purchase.
That makes total sense. We actually just had a part of a cow delivered up from Pennsylvania. And it's so funny. We sat down at the kitchen table with burgers made from that ground beef. And both of our boys were like, we're never eating store meat again. We were like, whoa,
whoa.
But it was delicious.
No, it was fantastic. You made mention of it before, and it was part of definitely what we want to discuss. Where do antibiotics and steroids and all of that stuff actually fit into this conversation?
Yeah. So, I'm on the dairy side, but it's similar across beef and dairy. So, all of our antibiotics are prescribed by a veterinarian, and both Natalie and I's products enter the conventional side of things. So we do have, the ability to give antibiotics. But I don't think that it is as like rampant as maybe people think either on that end. Again, it is a prescribed thing. And then we're giving a cow, if it is sick, antibiotics, but then we have a withdrawal or withhold period. And so for the dairy side, if we give a cow an antibiotics, then her milk is milked completely separate and her milk does not enter the food supply system at all. And then there is even like the withdrawal period after we stop giving her antibiotics, where we still continue to milk her separate until all of the antibiotics are out of her system. And that's based on a product by product basis, depending on, what type of antibiotic it is, what it's being used for, all of those things. And so on the milk side of things, we are testing to the parts per billion for every single tanker of milk leaving our farm is tested more than once. And it is tested not just for antibiotics, it's tested on quality, which is something we get paid for, is depending on the quality of the milk. It's tested for a lot of things, but antibiotics is one of them. And if it were to test positive, we have to dump the milk and we actually have to pay for it. Like we have to pay for the time and energy that went into, a truck driver coming to pick up the milk that didn't ultimately get picked up. Beef is similar as far as on the processing side. When that animal is harvested, they are looking for, antibiotic residue. And if it is found in an animal, they can trace it back exactly to the source. And we actually had an interview on our podcast about this exact topic from the processing side. And one of the things that I learned in that I found was fascinating is if, a rancher or a dairy farmer were to continually come up more than once as having antibiotic residue, they can actually be kind of like blackballed, where you won't pick up their milk, you won't process their beef. And so it is taken very seriously to ensure that there is no, product on the shelf with animals that have been treated with antibiotic, that would have that residue.
I get why people are concerned about this and ask questions about this and honestly look for that label. But I think it's important to remember or understand that if you care about animal welfare, or if that's something you would say, like if someone's like, do you, want cows to be treated good? Like, is that important to you? And if you were to say yes, antibiotics and vaccines fall under that for us as farmers and ranchers. We have to be able to treat a sick calf. We have to be able to give certain vaccines for, very rampant, easily spread diseases within the livestock industry. And so I completely get where we wouldn't want that in our food. I don't want that in my food either. But I don't think we can go to the extreme end where we are advocating for farmers and ranchers not to use antibiotics and vaccines. Because like I said, that it's a very important pillar under animal welfare for us. So I think it's kind of just remembering what Tara said, like just because it's being used at the beginning, it's actually really good that it's probably being used at the beginning because, farmers and ranchers are being very judicial about how we're using it. Like Tara said, it's coming under a prescribed need from a veterinarian. We're using it by case. So there was a need for it. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. And it doesn't mean it's going to be in your food just because it was used at the beginning of, the life cycle. I have a baby calf that we have to treat. We're not getting harvested until like 18, months down the road, and it's going under withdrawal periods. And so there's a lot of checks and balances, like Tara said, to ensure that just because a vaccine or an antibiotic was previously used in the animal's life, that it isn't going to end up in your meat.
Part of the reason why we don't have to be as concerned, especially when it comes to beef, is because we're talking about a ruminant animal. Does that make a difference between it being a ruminant animal versus, a single gastric animal like chicken, for example?
Yeah. And this is where I wish I was my husband, because he has his master's in ruminant nutrition. And so he could like totally geek out and give you guys, the scientific explanation of what's going on in the rumen and why it's different and why that's so true. But yeah, that is something that I think is not talked about a lot, is that cows are going to be ruminant animals. And so they're a lot different, even when it comes from the feed side of what they're eating versus like a chicken per se. And so this is kind of one of my soapboxes actually, but animal proteins get lumped together all the time. Like people just refer to animal proteins. And even the way the beef industry is set up, I mean, chicken and pork are very vertically integrated. That means, Tyson is going to own the chicken from the beginning to the end. That's very common in the pork and chicken industry. That is not at all how the beef industry is set up. We're very segmented. There's ranches owned by families like me, and then the animal gets sold to, intermediate people, and then it gets sold to the feedlot. Like the animal changes hand multiple times from essentially families throughout the beef supply chain. And so there's a lot of differences between a beef animal, but also the beef industry when it comes to the other animal protein industries.
Interesting. I want to say I'm grateful for the explanation. I think what I love the most about the two of you ladies and what you're doing is you're really squashing a lot of the fear mongering. Because I'll be honest, I'm like, oh my gosh, no antibiotics. Oh my gosh, not corn fed. Like it's got to be healthier, because I think that that's probably what the media has created. It is the narrative. It's what's created us to believe. And that's why I think there's this like push towards like lab meat, and it's totally safe, but that's like a whole other issue we'll get to in a second. There was even a video that the two of you did about McDonald's. And it's funny, we have a good friend that owns multiple McDonald's restaurants. And when I got to sat down and actually speak with her, I was shocked to learn how many small families and small farms actually supply the potatoes and the meat going to big food chains like that. I mean, that was really mind-boggling for me. And so to see that confirmed on your social media, I do feel like even someone as educated as we are, we're also uneducated in certain parts because of this overarching narrative that is in place maybe to scare us.
Yeah. And I mean, we are not immune to it either. I mean, within ag, it's such a complicated system, and it's a massive system that I think that we even fall like, I don't know anything that's happening in the fishing industry, right? Like we covered fishing on Discover Ag, and we had an expert come in so that we could get educated, because it's impossible for us to know, all the different facets of agriculture. And so I do think that, yeah, we fall victim to that as well. And I think in the world we live in with social media, we know that when you're on a polarizing edge of something or an extreme of something, it can make you go viral, right? So like instilling fear in people about something like food is very popular right now. I mean, I feel like I can't open up Instagram without seeing like, a food influencer, standing in a grocery store sharing about something. And then I'll take it to heart sometimes too. And then I'll have to be like, wait, go back. What's actually true here? What does this actually mean? And so it can be really hard to kind of like go through disseminate all that information and figure out what the actual truth is about, the food that's going to, big companies like McDonald's, or the food that we're picking up at our grocery store that's going onto our tables.
Yeah, I mean, it totally makes sense. I actually want to go there though with the supermarket food. The fact that you covered that there could be up to 1,000 different animals in supermarket meat. I mean, I was like, oh no, like no, and it's just important for the fact that if there is contamination or something of that nature, it is probably more likely, right? If it's in supermarket meat versus us going to a farm and getting ground beef like we have downstairs right now, sourced from one single cow. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So this is when people ask me a lot, because I'll stand by wanting people to feel safe about going into the grocery store and buying beef. Like I said, that's what ultimately our cattle end up. And so I know the practices we do in our operation, and I know the practices that I have other friends, family, neighbors that are in the ag industry that they do on their operations. And so I do want you to feel safe going to the grocery store. And so people are always like, well, why buy direct to consumer then, And I'm like, well, there are a lot of, differences and benefits to doing that. And this is one of the ones I talk about. Your whole cuts are not going to be very much different from, a grocery store to a direct to consumer because, we have a graded meat system, choice, select, prime. Things should be graded accordingly. So you should be getting, a prime in the grocery store should be similar to a prime steak that you're getting at your direct to consumer. Ground products, that is not the case. So if your guys' case, you picked up one cow and that one cow got turned into all the steaks, the roasts, and the ground beef. When animals processed in the US and to eventually go into the grocery store, it is not going to be one cow only that is your ground beef. They are actually melding a ton of different animals together. And the reason we do that in the US is that's actually most of the beef we import. So if you hear the US is importing beef and you're wondering like, why are we importing beef when we have, ranchers spread across our nation? We're actually importing a lot of lean trimming. And that is what we will put into the ground beef as well. So it's going to come from a bunch of different animals in the US and then usually imported beef. So animals from outside the US. And we do that because, some consumers want those lower ratios, that 70-30 beef, that 80-20. Like, I don't know tuning in what, percentage you like your beef to be cut at. But if you are one of the consumers that wants that leaner option at the grocery store, we don't have the means to do that with just US animals. And so we'll mix in and meld in those lean animals that we're importing. And that's where you get all the different animals together for the ground products.
First of all, we prefer the fattier. The fattier, the better.
Well, not always. There were years ago when we did bodybuilding shows and it was like extra lean all the way. So yes.
Well, now I'm glad we don't.
Me too.
We've gone the fatty route because, well, number one, it's far more tastier.
Yeah.
And far more filling and,
I'm happier.
Yes. Yeah. A lot more satiating. All right. So then let's get into, again, the food supply. I mean, we've talked a little bit about that. But even more specifically around milk. And Tara, I mean, I know that this is like something that you're passionate about because this is what you do on your farm. So we would love to know the differences between, again, raw milk, what we're finding in the grocery store, potential dangers or upsides of certain things.
Yeah, definitely. The raw milk conversation right now is definitely, it feels everywhere. Like, I feel like it is very trendy right now, this entire conversation.
Like Travis and Taylor. It's everywhere.
Yeah, it is. It's everywhere. Raw milk is maybe not quite to that extreme, but I would like it to be. I wish everyone was talking about milk that much. So I actually grew up on raw milk. And then when I was away at college, I chose conventional milk. And then when I got married, moved to my husband's farm, I was on raw milk again. And then ultimately when I was pregnant with my oldest daughter, I made the decision to go to conventional milk. So I feel like I've been run the gamut of milk options in my household. And so I do not think that raw milk is inherently bad or dangerous or anything. I do think that you are assuming some risk when you choose to drink raw milk. There is reasons we started processing, or pasteurizing milk. I mean, just like cooking a steak or cooking your fish, right? It also, one of the great things about pasteurization is shelf life. For people who are not able to finish a gallon of milk in 2 days, pasteurization is such a great option. So, and being able to transport it, further distances and all of those things. So there's benefits to both. There is a couple differences, obviously, from raw milk to what you think of in the grocery store. And it's not just pasteurization, it's also homogenization. So if you get raw milk and it is in your fridge, you need to shake the bottle of milk before you pour it on, pour it in your glass, pour it, wherever you are, because the milk will separate. The cream will rise to the top and then the milk will not have the cream as much in the bottom. And so homogenization is the process where it actually essentially shakes up the milk and keeps it so it stays a solid consistency. So you can have pasteurized milk that's non-homogenized. And I think sometimes when people talk about the taste difference between raw milk and pasteurized homogenized, they actually are referring to the homogenization because, that cream will rise to the top. And then pasteurization is obviously the process of heating up the milk. You heat it up to a pretty high temperature for about 2 seconds. And again, it will kill any bad bacteria. It allows us to have a longer shelf life on it, all of those good things. There is ultra pasteurized. And that is where you'll see some of the shelf stable products where it doesn't have to be refrigerated or it lasts for 9 months. And ultra pasteurized is where it's heated to a little bit higher temperature for a shorter amount of time. And then there's low temp pasteurization. I mean, if you've been in the milk aisle, there's a lot of things happening in the dairy aisle with a lot of different products. I ultimately did. My kids are on, I buy whatever milk is on the shelf at the grocery store, and feel really good about it. I don't necessarily fall in the camp of believing that raw milk has like superfood benefits beyond just milk. I think milk and steak in general are both such superfoods that if you're consuming them, no matter how you're consuming them, I think they're really great products. And lots of different reasons why I chose that. But I think that if you choose to drink raw milk, I always compare it to like going to a sushi restaurant. Like, I don't know if I would eat sushi off the side of the road from someplace I didn't know the name of, right? Like, if you're going to choose raw milk, I recommend knowing your farmer, know what they're testing for, making sure they're sanitizing their bottles. A lot of times contamination cannot come from the milk. It can actually come from an unsanitized bottle that may have been handled incorrectly. Make sure they are, what all are they testing for in their milk? And so there's a lot of questions I would personally ask if I was choosing raw milk. That I think comes down to kind of personal preference and then accepting that risk. Because one of the issues I think with raw milk is if someone gets sick from raw milk, it paints a really bad picture for all of milk. The majority of foodborne illnesses around milk are from raw milk. It's like disproportionately so. And that doesn't, I don't say that to like scare people away from raw milk or scare you about raw milk, but you have to accept that risk, I think, and know what you're choosing.
So interesting. And I love hearing your opinion. I'm part of homeschool communities where there's a lot of more homeopathic, natural homeschool moms, mama bears, we call them, right? We all are. And the interesting thing is there's a couple that really prefer the raw milk for their kids who maybe had like a dairy allergy or some skin issues. In your experience as a dairy farmer, have you ever heard of that or seen that? Like, what truth is there to that?
Yeah, I have heard that a lot. That is a big one. And, we're seeing that with the A2 milk as well, that some people are saying, and we have the lactose-free milk. There's, different options, but A2 is like a breeding genetics for a certain type of protein within the milk. And so I have seen a lot of that. There have been studies on it, but a lot of like inconclusive studies there as far as, there's not a lot of scientific evidence to back that up. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence as far as like people's personal experiences. And so that is why I'm a big, Natalie is too, a big food choice person. Like, I believe that if you can find a product that works well for you and your family, like, you should absolutely like do that. Again, both of my girls, I've chose to do pasteurized milk for some other reasons. We occasionally will incorporate raw milk. We are also homeschooled, so I feel like I fall in that category. So, there's times that we want to be able to make our own butter and all that kind of, fun stuff. And so we'll pick up the raw milk. It's funny for me, it was turning into a bigger hassle to remind my husband to pick up milk at the farm than it was for me to just buy it at the grocery store when I was already there. And so again, like, it's every family is going to have their different things that they have to, take into consideration. And so that is why I'm such a big advocate for food choice.
That totally makes sense, and love that we're in the homeschool community together. I didn't see that on your social, so awesome.
I am brand new to it. I'm 8 weeks in, and there are good days and bad days.
That is true. And there'll be more good days and more bad days. It's like it gets worse and it gets better, it gets worse, it gets better. We're 5 years in, and it's been an awesome choice. It's the same as you're purporting, I should say, with food. It's choice. If some people works different for them, I definitely don't think it's for everyone, but if you can do it, it's awesome. And if you ever need any advice, I got you, girl.
Thank you.
Right. So let's talk about the obsession that everybody's having right now around synthetic food. I mean, we talked about the avocado, and there's lab grown meat. And, this is supposedly a more humane and environmentally more friendly approach to food. What say you?
It's so bizarre. I just, sometimes you feel like you don't understand how you got to the place in society you are, where you're having some of the conversations. And for me, I'm obviously a little bit biased. I'm a cattle rancher, but I just generally don't understand how we could look at an animal, out at pasture grazing and, understand what it's actually doing for the ecosystem out there, from, manure and fertilization to the hooves and, from the grazing management, and just, that animal that is a ruminant animal has been doing that all the way since to the bite, back to the bison. So they're very integrated. They're a part of the land and they're very important for it. So, we take that and we look at this whole ecosystem, which I'm a woman of faith. So I'll say that, God designed, and then we contrast it to two men in lab coats who hit a button and out pops our steak. And somehow we think that that's not only better for the environment, but somehow that's better for our bodies too. And one of the problems with it, I think, is that those companies have been able to come out and say, without, maybe the evidence to support it or a body that regulates them, because that's one of the big differences between, like we're regulated by the USDA. These other lab-based companies, they don't have someone monitoring that way. So they've been able to come out and say, like, we're better for the environment, we're better for your health, but not really explain what that means. And as a consumer, we see those things and we're like, well, we want that. We want something great for the environment, something great for our health. So check, we'll take it. But now they're starting to actually funnel money into studying that. And there's actually been lawsuits. And so I do think we'll kind of come out of this as a society where we're like, okay, I can see that was the greenwashing it is, because now they're going to have to kind of support that. And the studies they've done on it show that lab meat is actually worse for the environment already. So I just know that the more studies that will come out, it'll just further support it. I think we'll kind of hopefully hedge out of this trend we're seeing to, like manufacture our food in those ways sooner than later.
We're a larger scale farm, and you always see the word factory farm online, and it's so frustrating. I mean, my backyard is our close-up cow pen, even though we're a larger farm, like we live right on our farm. And so when I see that word factory farm, Natalie and I always joke, like, a lab grown meat is literally a factory farm. Like, you are literally factorizing like meat production. And yet, like, farmers get criticized if we, use any sort of scale or, anything. And so it can be very frustrating. And I agree with Natalie's sentiment at the beginning. It's just like, how did we get here?
I agree. And I love Natalie saying even like the greenwashing. And just for those who don't know, it's basically a way of pretending that something is healthier than the original version. It's kind of like electric cars. I love when people are like, oh, I'm so, good for the environment because like I have an electric car. I'm like, do you know how they had to produce the electricity for your electric car? Like, there's a coal plant behind that, It's like, it's so mind-boggling that we think that the natural way of doing things is better by artificially doing it.
Well, and that also ties deeply into the conversation around emissions, right? So we opened up with, the true and false about cow farts and cow burps. And somehow, again, the narrative had been written that cattle is somehow giving off more emissions than some of the other parts of our lives, which really is not true. And I think maybe it was you, Natalie, mentioned a certain percentage, like 4% or so. I mean, let's just go into that conversation right now.
Yeah, I did not play the game correctly at the beginning. I'm sorry, I gave too much detail about
no, it's good. It's good. We love it.
Yeah, all of agriculture as a whole accounts for 10%. You're looking at like transportation, energy,
industry. I mean, just all industry, of the other commerce.
They're all about 30% equally, and then agriculture is coming in at 10%, and that is divided about in half between plant agriculture and animal agriculture. So I think animal agriculture is right around that 4% mark for greenhouse gas emissions when we look at data from the EPA, across the nation. So it is a pretty small part. We're obviously not denying we play a part. We will own up to our, emissions we do produce. But I think the ag industry has always taken that pretty seriously. And we here in the US, I would say, are one of the leaders in sustainability. I think sometimes people will mix global emissions or global data with, our nations. And U.S. farmers and ranchers are doing a lot, whether they're in the crop side of it or the animal side of it, to always focus and work on sustainability.
A fun fact about actually the ag and forestry sector is it's actually a carbon sink. So it is between 10 and 11% is our carbon emissions and 12% removal of carbon. So we actually remove more carbon than we put into the atmosphere as a whole, which is really, really cool. I mean, we're one of the only sectors where our job is literally to remove carbon to grow a food source or raise, cattle. And so it is a really cool piece. I mean, Natalie shared about like her cattle out on pasture and all the benefits there. My cattle are in like a pen, obviously, because we bring them into the dairy barn every single day. And so that is one of the things about a dairy is you're going to have cows in pens, but all the way down to their diets, like what our cattle are consuming is such a cool sustainability story. They consume a lot of byproducts, which I hate that word. It sounds like it's like bad or waste, but essentially, every piece of food that we make for human consumption, plant-based or clothing, you end up with a byproduct. Like when you make cotton, you end up with cottonseed, and cattle can consume those products. And that's a really cool piece of the sustainability story. Those products would all go to waste and go to a landfill and create even more emissions. But instead, cattle can take those products we can't eat and turn it into nutritious products that we can consume and that are so important for our health and our diet.
Like having a dog, they eat all the scraps on the floor.
Totally.
Except the dog just gives us love. Your animals give us
they're
food.
giving love, and we're getting meat and milk from our cattle. But I'll take the dogs too. The dog's love is very important.
Isn't also part of the challenge with a lot of the statistics that get thrown out there about the environment, and we're talking about carbon emissions and all of this stuff, is the comparison between the US and other countries, and that everything is getting lumped together. And that's not really like a fair way of assessing a lot of this, is it?
No, I mean, I will personally read articles where they'll say like agriculture accounts for like 35%, of greenhouse gas emissions. And then I have to like in my mind be like, okay, that's coming from a global, and that's adding in like food and packaging industry. Like it's from the beginning to the end of the food, basically supply chain. And so I do think there are articles, organizations that want to create a little more controversy or want to, maybe get a headline out there or get some virality. And so they'll interchange what works for them. I've even seen, the same article, well, they'll use global statistics at the beginning and then a US statistic below, and it's within the same article. And so reading it, you think it's, one length of like train of thought, and it's not. You have to bounce between a global perspective and then a size down, US perspective. And like I said, it's quite different. And I'm not saying we should only care about US emissions as US citizens, but I just think it's important to know that the numbers are obviously going to be larger and different if we're looking at like global numbers versus if we're just looking at like US statistics.
There is also a study that it, made pretty big shockwaves when it came out. And what they found is that they were not comparing like apples to apples. So for agriculture, they were comparing the entire life cycle from beginning to end, every single thing that was going into ag, as Natalie said, like packaging, transportation, of moving those products, everything. And then on the transportation side, they were only looking at tailpipe emissions, not what into making the car. How is the car going to biodegrade? And it's like, if we're going to be comparing some of these things on a global scale, we need to make sure our metrics are the same across the board of how we're doing these life cycle analysis. And that can lead to a lot of problems. I mean, you're talking about a much more inflated number than for ag compared to, the other industries that we're looking at. And so there's definitely some problems there with how we're reporting things and how we're even measuring things.
I mean, I think to your point, in one of your videos, you talked about the UN just voting that the world's most pressing problem is meat. And back to that, maybe confusing true or false, Harvard actually just reported that the new pandemic would be coming from meat. And it's ironic that we have people like our government, Bill Gates, releasing lab grown meat ahead of like next pandemic's going to be here. And we already have the solution here. It's like Billy Gates created computers and antivirus, and then all of a sudden we had computer viruses. It's like, wait a second, which one came first? Is it this meat pandemic, or did the lab grown meat magically just appear here as a solution? Why do you think that they're really trying to push that meat is going to be the source of a next pandemic? Why so much fear?
We've covered this a few times on the podcast, and we always get articles submitted about Bill Gates. So I feel like he must be one of the most name dropped people on our podcast because it's always in the headline. And, there's a lot of back and forth there. There's been times that we've covered Bill Gates where, and Natalie and I said the headlines got it wrong. Like, with him buying up farmland, that's a big one that we always see. And it's not always quite the way that media makes it seem. Like lots of countries own farmland in different countries. Lots of people invest in farmland. And then there's been other ones like the Lone Star tick we actually covered recently. And both Natalie and I were like, we both said we left that podcast kind of scratching our head being like, I feel like things are not adding up here. So I just feel like there's a lot going on in this space that it feels like there's a very narrative that got set up that like a lot of blame is being placed disproportionately on agriculture. And then the solutions coming in saying that they're healthier. And as we already mentioned, like saying that unregulated, unchecked. And it can be very frustrating. I feel like ag a lot of times gets set up as like the kind of quote unquote big bad ag industry, when in reality it's farmers and ranchers, family farms and ranches like Natalie and I that are scattered across the country that are actually making up like the true heart of agriculture. And so that can feel like a very uphill battle that we can be kind of facing and climbing.
And to talk about the reference you made to like, you said meat being the next pandemic, I think you're referring to an article we actually covered on the podcast. And when we dove into it, that's what the headline said, right? Again, to place ourselves with a certain way with the person reading it. But when we went through and read it, they were actually talking about like exotic animals the US is importing. They were talking about, like,
it was crazy. Natalie and I could not believe like how many exotic animals we were importing and like all the different like zoonotic, like diseases from those things. Like it was really wild, but the headline was the only thing that people like saw or remembered. And then when we dived in deeper, it was talking about like the Harvard study that you mentioned, and it was in a completely different direction than at the title kind of referenced.
Makes sense. I mean, we do talk about that. I got fooled. It's with coffee, coffee is so bad, but you get into this study and people are drinking 8 cups of coffee a day, which I'm like,
Yeah.
maybe aside from Mike, who else does that,
and who wants to have to read it beyond the headline, right? Like, isn't that the point of like a news outlet doing the hard work for us? And I think that's why I get so frustrated, is because I'm like, you're not doing anything. You're making me actually have to do more work by doing everything that you didn't do. And it's so frustrating because it's like, aren't you supposed to be able to read the headline and get the gist of it and understand it and like move on with your day? And instead, I feel like now we have to go like, as consumers, if we really want to be diligent about what we're consuming, it's like we have to click on the headline, read it, then go check the sources they were using and make sure they're credible, make sure there's no like it's so much work to actually take information from like our news sources now.
I agree, and I think there is this undercurrent that wants us to just believe what the headline says to again create fear for whatever reason we want to say. I recently saw something about tomato sauce, and then if you wanted tomato sauce made with sugar, it was like $1.99. But like the paleo version with no sugar, it was like $5.49. So it's like, we're paying more, we're working more. I mean, you do have to work, I think, against the current, especially in this country, to be healthy, to be well, I mean, there's a lot of money in sick people. And so I guess it does make sense.
And I think that, at the end of the day, it would almost be easier, instead of giving us news headlines, like just give us the study and let us read it and interpret it ourselves.
Let's actually cut out the middleman, because
it's gonna take just as much time to read through the whole thing as a New York Times article, a New York Slime article, and you're actually gonna get the meat of what the study was about. And that's, I know people like, not everybody likes reading research studies as much as I do.
I don't.
But
just a little light reading in your evening.
But I think it's important though to be able to, again, read between the lines, because even sometimes with studies, there'll be a headline there, and then you start reading deeper and deeper and deeper into the actual facts and the methods and, the outcomes in the discussion that happens, not just reading the abstract. And then you realize, okay, now I could rationalize this and that and the other thing. But yeah, unfortunately, most people are not going to do that. And so it sets a lot of us up to just fall prey to whatever headline is put out there.
And that's why, and I'm sure the same for you guys, but that's why we started our podcast, is because Tara and I were sick of seeing these headlines where we're like, A, that's not even true when you get into it, talking, because we focus on, food and agriculture. So talking about food and agriculture. But B, also be written by people, if you go to New York Times, it's usually by a person who lives, in New York. And I'm like, you didn't even interview a peach farmer, and you're not a peach farmer. So why are you reporting about peach farming, And so we really just were like, it would be really cool if we could actually just provide a space where two farmers actually gave a voice to the headlines we're seeing and discussed them. And maybe it is true. And that's what the discussion ended up being. Like, yeah, there was a lot of support for this, and it was a well done article, and this is what they're saying. And sometimes it ends up being like, yo, this is not at all what the press is telling you. When we dove into it, this is actually what we found and discovered, or this is what we learned ourselves. And so I'm sure you guys would echo the same thing, but it's like we have to start creating these think tank spaces where we can have these conversations instead of just relying on the Facebook headline anymore.
So one thing that I definitely wanted to touch on, and maybe this also does speak a little bit more directly to the environmental conversation, is that of regenerative agriculture. I mean, most of our audience probably has not heard of it or truly understand. Maybe they've heard the term thrown around, but can you guys just give a quick little overview of what regenerative is and how that plays into what we're discussing?
Yeah, it is definitely, I feel like, one of those buzzwords. I feel like 10 years ago, it was sustainability. Now it's regenerative ag, and, it all means something a little different. So in my mind, regenerative ag is basically like at its core is like leaving the land in a better place than when we got it. Like that we are putting back in, things, the nutrients into the soil, that we are just improving things instead of like the extraction mentality of, and, that goes beyond agriculture, but just that moving away from that extraction to really like, how can we work with our natural resources, our natural ecosystem. And I think one of the really cool things about regenerative ag is, in my mind, it's a spectrum. Like, it is not just simply like, right now, there is no label that is regenerative. It is not just like a checkbox, like, yep, you got the label, smack that label on that food package. It's really about working with your ecosystem, with, what makes sense for your farm or your ranch. And so it can look a lot of different ways. I mean, we sell into the conventional milk supply, as I've mentioned, but we try to implement different, regenerative practices, whether that that is composting our manure and sending it out to, other local farms in our area so that they can use less synthetic fertilizer and, more of, cow manure as a natural fertilizer, or, reducing water use. I mean, there's so many different things, but that's going to be so different in our area. In our area, we have very limited water. So we're looking at, crops that are drought resistant that need less water. If you are, east of the Mississippi, that's probably not going to be your focus area, right? You're going to be looking at runoff and concerns about surface water. And so that's personally what I love about regenerative ag, especially from, kind of my consulting days in environmental space, is everybody's going to have different natural resource concerns. And so being able to meet those and think about them in like a holistic way for your farm or ranch is really important.
Oh, I love that. And I think hopefully that cleared it up for some people, because like you said, it is like a buzzword today. And, I guess there's more claim laid to we should be going the regenerative route versus, I guess, what would be considered regular agriculture. I mean,
Yeah, that's kind of one of my concerns with it being a buzzword. I love that people are talking about it. I love that we're becoming aware of it, that they're like looking into it and they're like asking, our farmers and ranchers to do that, because like Tara said, at the end of the day, every farmer and rancher, if you're good at your job, if you're good at farming and ranching, you should have a regenerative mindset. And so, having our consumer on board with that is great. But I do fear that people look like a very common regenerative name in the beef space would be like white oak pastures, right? A lot of people are very familiar with what Will Harris is doing down in Georgia. And so I feel like sometimes people will look at his model and then they could look somewhere else. And like Tara said, maybe they're doing very regenerative practices on their operation, let's say here in Nebraska, where I'm at. But it's going to look different than the regenerative practices that Will's doing. We have different rainfall, we have different soil type. We're maybe running a different amount of animals. We have there's just so many terrain issues and environmental issues that will dictate regenerative practices. And so I do fear a little bit that people think it's like a model or a choice and are like, well, just do what Will Harris does, but do it in Pennsylvania and do it in Texas and do it in Montana. And you're like, well, that's just not how it works. But I promise we are being regenerative on our operation. It just looks like different than, what regenerative looks somewhere else. And regenerative agriculture can't really be like copy stamp repeated just because it is so different with what every producer is doing. I mean, we have soil here at our home base that is completely different than soil I have out at summer pasture. And that's like on my own operation. So I'm going to be focusing and treating the land, right here different than I do 15 miles away from me. And so to think that we could ask a producer in Nebraska to do the same regenerative practices that we ask a producer in New York to do, like, it's just not going to work. It would not be sustainable or regenerative. And so I think just being open to the idea that regenerative is going to look different and the practices are going to be implemented different. But at the end of the day, it's important that we are just implementing regenerative practices.
That even clears it up for me, because you're right. I mean, I'm familiar with white oak pastures and, I've seen some of the videos of what they're doing down there, but never considered that, again, regionally, that is going to look different from one area to another. And so thank you. I appreciate that, because that really clears it up for me. I just want, I always thought it was interesting because it's being talked about so much now. But what you're basically saying is that any rancher worth their salt is going to be doing this, should be doing this, but just in their own unique way.
Exactly. Yep. So, we'll have different stocking rates. So will be able to run different cattle, than we would be. But like our operation is focused on, we do rotational grazing. We have butterfly habitats planted. We have initiatives for our wildlife. And things we may be faced and concerned about are going to be different than what Will is, concerned about and facing and doing differently down in Georgia. And so they're going to look completely different. But if we're both good at our jobs, we can both be implementing regenerative practices. Yeah.
I also think it's a year over year thing and a little bit of an experiment. Sometimes I know a couple of years ago, we were trying out some different crop varieties. We thought they'd be more drought resistant. They were, but for some other reason they didn't work. And so then it was kind of like, okay, scrap that idea. Like, back to the drawing board. What's the next thing we can try? And so, it is like a year after year and some experimenting there of like, okay, what now that we've gotten this mastered, what else can we do? What else can we add? What else can we change? And I think that's really important too, is that it may not happen overnight. Natalie said, a lot of farmers and ranchers are wanting to be more regenerative, but it's how do they implement these practices while, still staying afloat and still staying within margins and all of those things. And so that's also like another piece of that, economic conversation.
I think the beautiful thing is just hearing, again, people who were born and raised in New York and not much exposure to farms. I mean, how many farms are on Long Island? Not many, right, Mike? I just think it's so beautiful to hear how much you care about the internet.
We care about the internet.
We care about that. Yeah, that's pretty important too.
I think we'll use the internet, but
I meant environment, but I was like, my next thought was what you see on the internet is not, that farmers are caring about the environment. There's this whole narrative, which again, we've covered in depth here. I don't want to go back, but I think it's beautiful what you're doing. And even Tara, that you've been doing environmental consulting for 10 years. I mean, like it's beautiful what you guys have created here. I want to throw out 2 more questions before we close up here. The first is red meat allergies. I mean, we definitely have gotten some pushback from people like, I'm allergic to red meat, and our personal stance is it may not be the red meat. It's probably what you're consuming with the red meat that maybe is making your stomach hurt or something like that. So in your experience, red meat allergies?
I personally have not seen a lot of red meat allergies. I mean, we've seen the Lone Star tick where that is creating some. I mean, obviously milk allergies falls into a little bit different category, but no, I am not super familiar with red meat allergy.
Like you said, it does remind me, it's kind of the same thing in pharmacy when, we're like, do you have a drug allergy? And people are like, oh yeah, I can't do penicillin. I'm allergic to penicillin. And then we're like, oh, okay, well, what were your symptoms? And they're like, oh, my stomach was upset. I'm like, oh, well, that's actually antibiotics are just, make your stomach upset. But they were told, or they thought that reaction was actually an allergy. And so sometimes I do think if people are having complications with like meat or milk, they'll label it as an allergy when maybe it was like something else going on.
Makes sense. Well, last question is, we're going to put everywhere that people can find both of you ladies, because the information you put out is so great. What is the best part about being a rancher or farmer? And is there anything else that we didn't ask that consumers should know?
Yeah, we covered a lot of things. So I loved our conversation today. But as far as what my favorite thing is, I grew up in it, so I guess I don't know any different, but I truly love like seeing my kids, raising my kids in this. It's such a family job. We can choose to go out with my husband throughout the day on the dairy. He, still comes home for lunch every single day. Like, I just love that aspect of it, that it is more than a job. I mentioned I live right on my farm. It's our entire lives. And I actually, as hard as that piece can actually be sometimes, it is truly what I love about it too.
I'd echo what Tara said. I do love how integrated this lifestyle enables us to exist as a family. We spend a lot of time together. I think probably more than like average people, unless you're homeschooling, do with their children and as a family. And I also love how integrated nature is into our lifestyle. I always have to chuckle, and I feel actually kind of bad chuckling about it, but I'll see things online that are like, get outside and expose yourself to the morning light, or, like take off your shoes and make sure you're grounding. And I think those are all really great practices, but it reminds me how lucky I am to actually be like, wow, I don't have to think about that much because, we're out in our outside, for like 80-85% of our day. And my children are usually never clothed to begin with. So I'm like, we got grounding down really well on our operation. We're running barefoot everywhere. And so I do love how like interwoven we are with nature when it comes to, being farmers and ranchers. As far as people listening, what I hope you take away is just maybe having a little less fear around the food system. I think we've gotten to kind of a scary and unfortunate place to be a consumer, because I do think there are marketing tactics and labels and greenwashing that go against us, that maybe insert fear into that gap between where food started and where food is consumed. And because there is kind of that gap there is just a place for misinformation and fear mongering to exist. And so I hope that you can listen to this podcast, or, follow our podcast, or follow us on socials, and maybe feel a little bit more trustworthy and comforted by the food system and the people who are behind it.
Well, I really appreciate this conversation today, because, if it was up to my wife, we'd be homesteading, and I just don't see that fitting into our lifestyle. And so I think you've given her a little peace and calm about, where we're getting our food, and the fact that we can still live this healthy lifestyle and get very nutritious protein and not have to worry about all the details. I think it's great for you. And I am quite happy working in and out of my gym every day. So
that makes me chuckle. Yes.
Thank you guys
we
so much.
saved you from a milk cow, and you're welcome.
You don't even know. I mean, the joke around me is, when you need something built or done, Mike's good for picking up the phone and dialing somebody else. So I truly appreciate it. And just tell everybody again, we'll put it in the show notes, but let them know where they can find you.
Yeah, if you obviously are listening to this, you love podcasting. So you can find us on our podcast, Discover Ag. It's a Thursday episode. Every Thursday, we cover the top news articles in the ag and food space. We bring a very, I feel like, relatable, approachable millennial spin to all of those news articles. And then you can find us over on socials. You know, both of us go by our personal names on our socials. So Tara Vander Dussen and at Tara Vander Dussen across all the platforms. And the same for Natalie Kovarik at all of the platforms as well.
Love it. Well, thank you ladies so much. And we look forward to listening more.